Amazon reported fiscal 2023 first quarter earnings results that were really interesting in that it had great execution in certain areas, but the stock price is down on the day after the earnings were announced. So in this video, I'm going to review the big picture highlights from Amazon's earnings report, and I'll also answer and explain why Amazon's stock price is down despite the fact that it had a relatively good quarter. So, without further ado, let's begin. The first thing I want to look at here is in Amazon's earnings release, they had a few things here. Um, the area they had really good execution on and really good growth in is in its advertising services segment. You see here, I've highlighted it grew 23% in the first quarter to reach $9.5 billion. And I reviewed Roku's earnings release. I think I did that one yesterday. And in Roku's um, announcement, management was talking about how in the first quarter, advertisers decreased spending by nearly 8% compared to last year. So overall, industry advertising spending was down 8% year over year in Q1. So despite an 8% decrease in overall ad industry spend, Amazon grew its ad revenue by 23%. 23%. So it outperformed the market by 31%, meaning it gained significant market share. So that's really good news. If you're thinking about Amazon stock long term, that's a really good step in that direction because remember, ad revenue is very lucrative. Very lucrative. Ad generating ad revenue is a high profit margin business, just like this next business, which is not going so well for Amazon, and that's the cloud services segment, AWS. This is the breadwinner for Amazon stock. This is where the vast majority of Amazon's profitability comes from the AWS segment. However, if you note here, I've highlighted AWS, and what I've highlighted is the year over year revenue growth. And you can see this is not going in the right direction. 40%, 37%, 33%, 28%, 20%, and 16% growth in its most recent quarter. And if you, I've reviewed Microsoft's earnings already and Alphabet's earnings. Both Microsoft and Alphabet's cloud segment grew by faster than Amazon's cloud segment. So, in contrast to the advertising revenue, where it gained market share and did better than the industry, in AWS, Amazon did worse than the industry. And this is where the bulk of the company's profitability comes from, which I will show you a little bit later in the video. And this is why it's such a big deal and such a big negative to Amazon stock investors when they see this growth in AWS slowing. So the next thing I wanted to talk about as a positive from Amazon's earnings report is expense control. Now, the first thing I'll look at is shipping costs, worldwide shipping costs year over year growth. And look at the trend line here. 4 or 5 quarters ago, shipping costs increased by 10%, 14, and then 14%, 9%, 10%. So double digits or near double digits growth in shipping costs, even though, look at the bottom, is worldwide paid units growth. So they only increased 3% more units, but their cost increased by 10%. The following quarter, units were flat. It's not like they shipped any more things, right? They shipped the same amount of things, but their cost increased by 14%. 14% on flat increase in units. The quarter after that, only 1% increase in units, but shipping costs increased by 9%. So this was getting out of control. Amazon really needed to fix this, and the good news is that they have. In the recent 3 quarters, this is more in line. Now you've got unit growth of 11% and shipping cost growth of only 10%. So the unit growth outpaced shipping costs. The same with the previous quarter, 8% growth in units, only 4% growth in shipping costs. And finally, in the most recent quarter, 8% growth in units and only 2% increase in shipping costs. So they're finally getting shipping costs under control. That's big news. And you'll see that in the turnaround in the North American segment, which I'll show you again later in the video. Another thing I was happy to see is they reduced their employee count to 1.465 million. That was down from 1.541 million in the previous quarter, so nearly 80,000 job cuts. Now, I'm not happy to see this. The people that lost their jobs, obviously, they're not in a good place, and I'm not happy to see it because people lost their jobs. But instead, I'm happy to see it because it helps bring down Amazon's costs and expenses, which were the area that had gotten out of control and why Amazon's stock has been down so significantly off its highs. Okay, I want to thank the Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. Visit fool.com/parkev for the 10 best stocks to buy now. Let's look at how that translated into the actual big picture items in financial metrics. So revenue in the quarter increased by 9% to 127 billion. Operating income actually rose to 4.8 billion, up from 3.7 billion year over year. This was much better than Amazon management had forecasted for the current quarter in terms of operating income. AWS, which I mentioned earlier, operating income of $5.1 billion. This was down from 6.5 billion, but by far the most profitable segment out of the three reportable Amazon segments. So Amazon reports AWS, North America, and International. AWS generated 5.1 billion in operating income. North America generated 900 million in operating income, and the international segment actually generated an operating loss of 1.2 billion dollars. And the North America and international segment includes its e-commerce sales. So its e-commerce business overall was still not profitable in the quarter. You can say it was negative 300 million in the quarter, although there's some nuance to that calculation. But just for looking at how important AWS is, AWS generated 5.1 billion in operating income, while the whole company overall generated 4.8 billion in operating income in the quarter, meaning the rest of the business was negative 300 million when AWS was 5.1 billion. That's why investors are concerned about that decelerating trend of growth for AWS that I showed you earlier in the video. Every quarter for the last 5, AWS's revenue growth has fallen, and in the most recent quarter, the operating margin in AWS also fell. So that's where investors were concerned about this most recent Amazon earnings release. Operating cash flow increased by 38% to 54 billion in the trailing 12 months, and the company's guiding for second quarter revenue growth of 7.5% and operating income in the range of 2 to 5 billion. In the second quarter last year, Amazon generated 3.3 billion in operating income. So at the midpoint of this forecast of that would be 3.5 billion. That would be another increase in operating income year over year, which would be the second consecutive quarter of operating income growth after several quarters of operating income declines. So if you look at Amazon's overall business, the company made several very good steps forward. Several. You could think about the employee reduction. You could think about the reduction in shipping costs. You could think about the operating income profitability in the North American segment, which had a loss of 1.6 billion in the same quarter the prior year. So you could look at several things and say, man, Amazon had a really good quarter. And then you can look at AWS and the decline, the continued trend of decline, the decrease in the operating margin in that segment, and just that one thing alone was enough to to ruin the optimism from Amazon's execution in the current quarter. And it's because AWS is such an important part of Amazon's business valuation that that segment carries so much more weight. So what happens in AWS carries so much more weight than what's happening in the rest of the business. So all of those good things that you saw in the rest of the business were, yes, they were positive, but the weight that it carries is just not anywhere near the weight that AWS carries. And you can see why that's the case, because AWS is the segment of the business that generates all more than 100% of the operating income in the business. All right, so that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And this is only my first step into Amazon's latest earnings. I will be doing deeper dives into Amazon's latest earnings results. So if you want to make sure you don't miss out on that, make sure you hit the subscribe button and stay tuned to my updates. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching.